She made one decision in 4 minutes of cold rain, and it cost her everything she thought she wanted and gave her everything she never knew she needed. 4 minutes. That is the whole arithmetic of it. She knelt on a flooded roadside shoulder somewhere outside the city, her hands blackened with road grime, her coat ruined, past saving, and she fixed the flat tire of a man whose name she did not yet know. She did not stop because she expected anything. She did not stop because someone was watching. She stopped because an elderly man was standing alone in the dark in the rain with his hazard lights blinking orange into the wet asphalt. And she possessed, as she had always possessed, the precise inability to keep driving past a thing that needed doing. That single act of ordinary decency detonated inside a world she did not know existed. And the man who would eventually look her in the eye and say quietly, "You are the only person in 3 years who did not first ask who I am," was not the old man on the roadside. It was his grandson. And his grandson, at that moment, controlled more of the city's shadow architecture than most people know cities contain. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? She was kneeling in the rain, and the story starts there. Her name was Yoon Chae-rin, and she was 31 years old, and she had spent the better part of a decade building a small logistics consultancy out of a second-floor office above a dry cleaning shop in Mapo, the kind of firm that did not appear in any industry magazine and survive entirely on its reputation for quiet, exact, reliable work. She had 3 employees, she had 14 clients, she had a lease on a 40-square-meter apartment that she shared with one aging cat and a wall of precisely ordered bookshelves. She was not unhappy, she was not particularly happy. She was functional in the way that a well-maintained machine is functional, humming steadily, wearing invisibly, producing output that others depended upon without ever quite noticing the mechanism. She had been driving back from a client site that evening, the kind of visit that runs 2 hours past its scheduled end, because the client in question cannot stop adding scope to a project that was already overscoped, and the rain had begun in earnest around 9 in the evening, the kind of heavy autumn rain that Seoul produces when it decides to mean it. Driving sideways across the Olympiad overpass and turning the road surface into something closer to a shallow river, she nearly missed him. The orange hazard lights registered first as a smear in her wet side mirror, and then she was already past him, and then she was not, because she had tapped the brake and pulled to the shoulder in a single reflex that bypassed whatever part of the brain manages rational risk assessment. She remembered thinking that whoever was in that car was either elderly or injured because the hazard lights were blinking, but no one had gotten out. She grabbed the waterproof kit from her trunk, the one she had bought 3 years earlier after her own roadside experience had taken 2 hours and 40 minutes to resolve through the official channels, and she walked back through the rain to the stationary car. He was elderly. He was perhaps 78 years old, possibly older. He was sitting in the driver's seat of a black sedan that was considerably newer and more expensive than anything she would have predicted for a man who appeared, at first glance, to be simply an old man in a good coat. He was not injured. He was simply unable to bend the way the task required. His hands, when she saw them through the window, were knuckled with arthritis. He had been sitting there for 22 minutes, she would learn later, and he had not called anyone, and she would also learn later exactly why that was. She tapped the window. He rolled it down. He looked at her for a long moment with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to assess people quickly and thoroughly. "Can you leave me the kit?" he said. "I will manage." "You won't," she said, not unkindly, matter of fact. She managed it herself. It took her 4 minutes and 11 seconds, working in the rain with the kind of efficient economy of movement that comes from having done a thing before and having no patience for unnecessary steps. She did not complain about the rain. She did not make a performance of the effort. She changed the tire, stowed the flat, closed the trunk, and returned his emergency kit to him through the window. He held it a moment. He looked at her again. "You did not ask my name," he said. "It didn't seem necessary," she said. She drove home. She showered. She ruined the coat trying to salvage it and eventually threw it away. She forgot about the old man by the time she reached her second cup of tea. Or, she thought she had. The cat sat on her feet. The rain continued. She went to sleep. She did not know as she slept that the old man had sat in his car for another 7 minutes after she drove away, looking at the road where she had knelt, thinking thoughts she would only understand much later. She did not know his name was Kwon Dae-sung. She did not know that for 40 years, that name had meant something in the city's underground architecture that most ordinary people never encounter directly and never forget if they do. She did not know that Kwon Dae-sung had 3 grandchildren, 2 of whom he spoke of openly and 1 of whom he did not speak of at all, and that the one he did not speak of was named Kwon Jae-han, and that Kwon Jae-han was 34 years old and had, in the preceding 7 years, consolidated control over the kind of city networks whose operation everyone who benefits from a functioning city prefers not to examine too closely. She did not know any of this. She woke up the next morning and opened her laptop and sent 3 project status updates to 3 different clients and responded to 14 emails and 8 toasts standing at her kitchen counter. And her life was exactly as it had been and would have remained so, except that at 11:17 that morning her office phone rang and a voice she did not recognize asked if this was the firm of Yoon Chae-rin, and she said yes, and the voice said that Mr. Kwon Dae-sung wished to thank her properly. She said that wasn't necessary. The voice waited 1 beat, then said, "He insists." She met the old man 3 days later at a tea house in Bukshan that she could not find any record of online when she searched it afterward, which she found faintly odd, though she filed it away without deciding what it meant. The tea house occupied the ground floor of a converted hanok and smelled of old wood and roasted grain, and Kwon Dae-sung was already seated. When she arrived, his hands folded on the table with the careful arrangement of a man who has learned to disguise discomfort, and he rose when she entered with a formality that made her feel, briefly and strangely, like she had done something more significant than change a tire. They drank tea for an hour. He asked about her work with the precision of someone who had already done substantial background research but wanted to hear it from her directly. She answered without false modesty and without inflation, because she had no instinct for either. She described her firm as, it was small, careful, specialized in the kind of supply chain problem that larger consultancies dismissed as insufficiently profitable, and smaller ones lacked the analytical depth to solve. She said she had 14 clients. She said she expected to have 17 by the following spring, if a particular contract she was currently in the final stages of negotiating came through. He listened to every word. She noticed that. He had the quality rare in anyone, and rarer still in someone of his apparent stature, of listening not for the pause that would allow him to speak, but listening as though the information itself was the point. "My grandson," he said eventually, "has a problem that resembles your description of your work." She waited. "He will not tell you it resembles your work," the old man said. "He will frame it differently. He is careful about how things are framed." A pause. "You should be careful about that also." She did not ask which grandson. She understood it was not an ordinary referral, even if she did not yet understand why. She said she was happy to speak with him, and she meant it, and the old man nodded once and looked at his tea, and she had the impression that he was satisfied with her answer, and also that he had expected it to be exactly what it was. Kwon Jae-han did not call for 11 days. She did not think about him during those 11 days, or she mostly did not. She thought about her contract, which stalled at the final stage due to a disagreement over liability terms that she suspected was being manufactured as leverage. She thought about the third quarter numbers for two of her existing clients and about a routing inefficiency she had identified in a cold chain delivery network that, if solved cleanly, would reduce spoilage by somewhere between 18 and 22%. She thought about the old man occasionally in the way you think about an unresolved question, which is not quite worry and not quite curiosity, but something that sits slightly forward in the mind. On the 11th day, at 6:47 in the evening, her mobile phone showed a number she did not recognize, and the man on the other end of it said, without greeting or preamble, "My grandfather says you do not waste time." "He's right," she said. "Then I will not either." He paused for 2 seconds exactly. "I have a logistics problem. It is not straightforward. I need someone with analytical precision and no interest in circumstances peripheral to the problem." She thought about this for a moment. "What kind of logistics problem?" she said. "The kind where a large volume of legitimate goods is moving through a distribution chain that someone is using to conceal a smaller volume of illegitimate ones, and I need to identify exactly where the contamination is happening and who is responsible for it without alerting the person responsible that they are being identified." The rain had come back that evening. She remembered, lighter than before, tapping against her office window with a sound like fingers on a desk. She said, "That's a mapping and pattern analysis problem. It's also potentially a legal problem, depending on what you do with the finding." "The legal dimension is not your concern," he said. "The analysis is, what are the legitimate goods?" he told her. It was a cold chain pharmaceutical distribution network. The goods in question were temperature-sensitive medical supplies moving through a 6-city regional chain. The scale was large, the operational complexity was substantial, and the contamination, if it was what he believed it to be, was sophisticated enough to have survived 2 previous internal audits without surfacing. She spent 2 days not deciding. And then she decided. She met him on a Thursday morning in a conference room in a building in Yungu that bore the name of a property management company she had looked up and found to be entirely real, entirely legitimate, and apparently quite profitable. The conference room was clean and spare, the coffee was good. He was already there when she arrived, which was a different kind of punctuality than the old man's, not a formality but a control. He was 34 years old. He was tall and assembled with the particular precision of someone who had decided at some point that their physical presentation would be one more thing they would not leave to chance. He wore a plain dark suit and no watch she could see, which she noticed because people in his implied position usually do the opposite. He looked at her the way his grandfather had looked at her. Fully, not appraisingly, exactly, just completely. She said, "I've reviewed the parameters you described. I need full access to the distribution logs going back 18 months, the routing records for all 6 transit hubs, the temperature monitoring data, and the procurement to delivery reconciliation files." He said, "You'll have them by tomorrow morning." She said, "I'll also need a protocol for flagging anything I identify before any action is taken. I don't report a finding and then have something happen before I understand what happened." He looked at her for a moment. This was a boundary. He had not been expecting a boundary. "Agreed," he said. She began the work. It took her 6 weeks. 6 weeks of 12 and 14-hour days. Of spreading printouts across the length of her office floor because the pattern was too large for any single screen, of building analytic models that she rebuilt 3 times when she found inconsistencies in her own assumptions. Her 3 employees knew she was on a large private engagement. They did not know for whom. She had not told them and did not intend to. The contamination was elegant in its construction. Someone had been using the cold chain network to move a secondary cargo, not drugs, as might have been assumed, but counterfeit pharmaceutical components, inactive substitutes, inserted into shipments of legitimate medication at exactly one node in the 6-city chain, specifically a transit warehouse in Incheon that handled handoff between the regional network and a downstream distributor. The insertion was timed to the shift rotation. It had been happening for 14 months. It was, she calculated, affecting approximately 1 in every 47 shipments. The financial gain to whoever was running it was considerable. The human cost, if the counterfeit components had reached patients, was a calculation she did not want to make, and made anyway, in a single column on a separate sheet of paper, and then set face down on her desk. She called him at 10:41 on a Tuesday night, and said, "I have the finding. I need to deliver it in person. Tomorrow," he said, 7 in the morning. She said, "Fine." She arrived at 7. She spent 48 minutes walking him through everything: the methodology, the pattern, the specific node, the timing signatures, the identity of the shift supervisor at the Incheon warehouse, who was the only person with consistent access at the moment of every contaminated shipment, and the separate secondary trail of digital breadcrumbs she had found that connected the shift supervisor not to a freelance operation, but to a competitor company's logistics director, who had by her count been running this extraction operation as a competitive sabotage effort against the distribution network's primary client. He listened without interruption. He asked 4 questions. Each one went exactly to the load-bearing joint of a different section of her analysis. When she finished, he sat for a moment looking at the organized stack of documentation she had placed on the table, and then he looked at her. "The column face down on the desk," he said. "You mentioned it. She had not mentioned it." He waited. "Estimated patient exposure," she said. "Worst case, given the contamination rate and the medical urgency profile of the specific supplies involved, I calculated a potential adverse outcome risk across a patient population of between 400 and 900 individuals over the 14-month period." He did not react visibly. "The worst case outcomes," he said. "I don't know," she said. "I'm not a clinician, but I flagged it in the documentation. It's in the appendix, section 4. If any of those shipments reached end use, someone in the medical chain should know." "They will," he said. He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. "You are the only person in 3 years," he said, "who did not first ask who I am." She considered that. "I knew who you were," she said, "by the 2nd week. It's all available if you look at the right things. I just didn't think it changed the analysis." He picked up the documentation. He stood. "What do you want?" he said, not manipulatively. The way a person asks who has learned that transactional transparency prevents a great deal of later difficulty. "I want the patient exposure flagged through the appropriate medical regulatory channel before you do anything else with this," she said. "Then whatever arrangement makes sense for the analytical work." He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the impression, for the first time but not the last, that she had just passed a test she had not known she was sitting. "The notification," he said, "will be made today before noon." She went back to her office. She returned 3 client calls she had been neglecting. She ate a convenience store lunch at her desk and felt, in a way she could not immediately explain, lighter than she had in some time. The cat at home was probably asleep on the bookshelves. Outside her office window, the city was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, enormous, full of systems that ran without most people knowing they were running. The agreement they reached for the analytical work was a fair retainer and an ongoing consulting arrangement for what he described only as systemic analysis projects. She did not ask for more detail. She understood that more detail would come as it became relevant, and that pressing for it before it was relevant was a kind of impatience she had never had. Over the following 8 months, she worked on 4 such projects. Each was, on its surface, a logistics or distribution or supply chain problem. Each contained, below that surface, the shape of something more complicated, a concealment, a manipulation, a quiet extraction of value from a system by someone who had positioned themselves to be invisible inside it. She came to understand, very good at finding people who had decided to be invisible. She did not flatter herself that she understood the full territory she was working in. She understood her function within it. And her function was clean and specific and bounded by the protocol she had established in the first meeting, which he had not once violated. She saw Kwon Dae-sung again at a small dinner, 4 months into the arrangement held at a private restaurant where she appeared to be the only guest whose presence required explanation. The old man ate with the economical pleasure of someone who has learned not to take ordinary things for granted. He asked about her work without asking about his grandson. She understood this was also deliberate. Near the end of the dinner, while the staff was clearing the last course, he said, "He told me about the column face down on the desk." She looked at him. "He said you calculated it anyway," the old man said, "when it would have been easier not to." She said it needed calculating. He nodded, looked at his tea. "There are people in his world," he said carefully, "who know only how to look at things that are useful to them. You looked at something because it was true." A pause. "He doesn't encounter that often." She did not say anything to this because she did not know what to say, and she had long ago learned that silence was almost always a better response than filling a space with words that weren't ready yet. She did not see Kwon Jae-han outside of their professional engagements for another 6 months. Then one evening she was working late in her office when her phone showed his name, and she answered, expecting a project question, and he said, "Are you hungry?" And the pause that followed was different from his other pauses. She said generally yes. He said, "Then come, have dinner, not about work." She sat with this for 3 seconds. "All right," she said. They ate at a place in Yeonam-dong that was small and loud and not the kind of place she had expected. And he ate like someone who had been eating at expensive and careful restaurants all his life and was genuinely relieved to be somewhere with paper menus. They talked for 3 hours. She learned that he had read economics at a university in England for 2 years. Before circumstances had redirected his trajectory entirely, that he spoke 4 languages and was learning a 5th with the methodical patience that she was beginning to understand characterized everything he did. That he had a specific and strongly held opinion about the structural deficiencies of Seoul's last-mile cold chain infrastructure that was, on the merits, entirely correct, and that he laughed exactly the way his grandfather laughed, a short, compressed sound like something escaping containment. She did not think about whether this was complicated. It was obviously complicated. She thought about it the way she thought about all complicated things, which was to identify its actual components and assess them honestly rather than at a distance. She drove home through light traffic and sat in her parking space for 4 minutes before getting out, looking at nothing in particular. She thought, "This is real." She thought, "That is worth knowing." The difficulty, when it came, arrived not from the direction she might have anticipated. It did not arrive as danger or violence or anything she had been quietly preparing herself for in the abstract. It arrived as something more ordinary and, for that reason, more cutting. It came in the form of a journalist. His name was Oh Sung-min, and he was 38 years old, and he worked for an online news outlet that specialized in the kind of investigative reporting that is carefully sourced and devastatingly timed. He had been building a story for 7 months. She learned this on a Wednesday morning when one of her clients called her, clearly uncomfortable, to say that a journalist had contacted them with questions about her firm and specifically about the nature of a contract engagement she had completed the previous year, and what he was implying in his questions was not a legal question but a reputational one. She called Kwon Jae-han immediately. He picked up on the second ring. She told him what she knew. He listened without interrupting. "I know about him," he said when she finished. There was something in his voice she had not heard before, a tightness. "How long have you known?" she said. A pause. 2 seconds. "Long enough that I should have told you sooner." She sat with this. "What is he building?" she said. "A profile," Kwon Jae-han said of the network, using the periphery to get to the center. "He's working outward from the people who interact with me through legitimate channels." A pause. You are a legitimate channel, but you are also, by now, closer to the center than the periphery. She understood what he was not saying. If the story runs, she said, it doesn't just describe me as a contractor. It describes me as a knowing participant in whatever characterization he's building of the larger structure. Yes, he said. Is the characterization accurate? A longer pause this time. Parts of it will be accurate, he said. Parts of it will be constructed from accurate pieces assembled to support a conclusion that is not. She got up from her desk and walked to her office window. The city below was mid-morning, busy, delivery vans and pedestrians, and the bright signage of the dry cleaning shop below, which had been there for 30 years and would probably outlast everything. I need to know, she said, whether there is anything in the work I did for you that would not survive scrutiny. He said, no. She said, I need to know because I'm about to make decisions about my own exposure, and I will only make them correctly if the information I'm working from is complete. The work you did is clean, he said. All of it. The pharmaceutical analysis triggered a regulatory investigation that is ongoing and will result in prosecutions that are entirely appropriate. The other engagements are defensible as supply chain consulting. The characterization risk is not about the work, it's about the association. She nodded, though he could not see it. Then the problem is manageable, she said, but I'll manage my portion of it myself. She could hear him processing this. I have people who can, ow. I know you do, she said. I'll manage my portion myself. She spent the next 3 days preparing a documentation package, a precise, comprehensive record of every engagement she had conducted, every deliverable, every communication, the regulatory notification in the pharmaceutical case with its date and timestamp, and a clean legal letter prepared by an attorney she trusted addressed to the news outlet. Not threatening and not obstructive, simply establishing the factual record with precision that would make any deviation from accuracy legally costly. On the 4th day, Oh Sungmin called her directly. She had expected this. He was measured and professional and skilled at the particular verbal geometry of a journalist who's trying to get a subject to say something more than they intended to. She had, in a different register, the same skill. They spoke for 40 minutes. She answered every question that pertained to her work, exactly and completely. She did not answer the questions that were framed to obtain characterizations of other people or entities. When he pushed on those, she said quietly, "That's a question I'm not positioned to answer accurately, and I don't give inaccurate answers." He said, eventually, with a slight change in tone, "You're quite careful." "I'm accurate," she said. "Careful implies I'm concealing something. I'm not concealing anything. I'm just only saying what I know to be true." The story ran 6 weeks later. It was long and it was serious, and it was, in the places where it touched her, exactly as factual as she had ensured it would be. Her name appeared twice in sentences that described her as a logistics consultant who had performed analytical work that led to a regulatory investigation which was accurate. Nothing more. She read it the morning it was published and then closed her laptop and went to make tea. Won Jae-han called at 8:47. "You read it?" he said. "Yes." "Your portion is clean." "I know," she said. A pause. Then, in a tone she had not heard from him before, quieter and less composed than his usual register. "I should have told you about him earlier, before it became pressure." She poured her tea. "Yes," she said, "you should have." He let this land without deflecting it. "That won't happen again," he said. She thought about this, not about whether she believed him, about whether it was the kind of statement that could be verified, and whether verification was the right response, and whether she had, in the construction of a professional relationship that had become something more confused, functional reliability for the kind of honesty that a genuine relationship requires. She said, "I want to tell you something." "All right," he said. "I can do complicated," she said. I've been doing complicated since I walked back through the rain to your grandfather's car, but I don't do withheld. Complicated, I can map. Withheld, I can't, and I won't try. A long pause, the longest he had ever given her. I understand, he said. I don't need you to understand, she said. I need you to agree. I agree, he said. She believed him, not because he had said it, because of everything that surrounded the saying of it, the length of the pause, the absence of any effort to reframe it, the plain directness that she had come to recognize as his version of maximum honesty. She drank her tea. The cat knocked something off the bookshelf in the other room. The city went on outside. Weeks passed. The pharmaceutical regulatory investigation concluded with 3 indictments. The shift supervisor at the Inchin warehouse cooperated in exchange for a reduced charge and named the logistics director, who had commissioned the operation. The logistics director was arrested on a Tuesday morning and appeared before a camera in handcuffs in a way that circulated briefly on news sites. The relevant medical authorities issued a notification to the downstream patient population, bounded by the exact shipment records she had flagged, enabling targeted follow-up clinical assessments. The estimated adverse outcome risk in Section 4 of her appendix would, she was told months later through indirect confirmation, not be realized at its worst-case figure. The follow-up assessments found outcomes at the lower end of her range, which was still a number and still mattered, and she thought about it sometimes in the way you think about numbers that represent people. She moved her firm to a larger space in the spring. Not a grand move, 2 additional rooms in the same building, which allowed her to hire 2 more staff and take on the kind of projects that her previous square footage had made operationally awkward. The dry cleaning shop below remained. She had, in a small act of loyalty she would not have described as loyalty, gotten all her winter coats cleaned there for 3 years running. She and Kwon Jae-han developed what she would have described, if asked, as an honest relationship, which is not the same as a comfortable one. It was honest in the way that 2 people are honest when both of them are too analytically rigorous to sustain an unexamined premise. They argued on occasion with the specific quality of argument that happens when both parties respect each other's thinking and disagree about a conclusion. She won approximately half of these arguments. He won the other half. This was, she thought, about right. She met his grandfather 4 more times over the following year. Each time the old man asked about her work. Each time she told him. Each time he listened with that complete attention, and each time near the end of the meeting he said something that she filed carefully away and thought about later. The last time she saw him, he said, "You know what he tells me about you." She said she didn't. "He says you look at the column face down on the desk," the old man said every time, whatever the project. "You always make the calculation no one asks for, because the truth is the truth, whether anyone wants the number or not." He looked at his tea. He says he's never had that before. She looked at the table for a moment. "It's not a virtue," she said. "It's just how I'm built." The old man smiled. Not broadly, briefly, and with the precision of someone for whom smiles had always been resource managed. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly what he says about you." She drove home through the city. The autumn rain had come back, the way it always did, every year the way things returned. The streets were wet and orange-lit and full of people navigating their separate complications with the general, impressive human competence that she had always found moving in people, the way they figured things out mostly. One imperfect step at a time. She thought about 4 minutes in the rain. She thought about how a decision of that duration, made without expectation, without calculation, made simply because an old man was sitting alone in the dark with his hazard lights blinking and she was incapable of driving past a thing that needed doing, had rerouted the entire subsequent geography of her life without ever asking her permission. She did not think this was cosmic or fated. She thought it was the ordinary operation of what happens when you show up completely for ordinary moments, when you do not withhold effort or attention or honesty because the situation does not appear to warrant it. She had knelt in the rain because it needed doing. Everything after was downstream of that. She pulled into her parking space. The rain was steady now, reliable, the sound of it a kind of percussion on the roof of her car. She thought about the old man's line. You are the only person in 3 years who did not first ask who I am. She had always thought the truest thing about that moment was that she had genuinely not needed to ask, because who someone is, in the sense that matters, is not the answer to the question, who are you? It is the accumulation of what they do when no one is assessing the value of doing it. She had known who she was on that wet roadside in precisely the way that mattered, and the old man had seen it in 4 minutes and had apparently described it to his grandson with enough precision that the grandson had been looking for her, in one sense or another, without knowing he was looking ever since. She got out of the car. The rain fell on her without apology. She thought, that is fine. She walked inside. She made tea. The cat appeared from somewhere warm and settled against her without ceremony, and the city outside her window went on, being enormous and indifferent and full of systems, visible and invisible, running on the mostly unacknowledged labor of people who show up and do the thing that needs doing. She opened her laptop. She had work in the morning, new numbers, new patterns, new columns that would need calculating whether anyone wanted the figure or not. Outside, the rain continued. It always does. And somewhere in the city, an old man with arthritic hands was probably sitting with his tea, looking at something the rest of the world had decided it could afford not to see, and taking the full measure of it the way he had always done, the way he had recognized in her from the moment she tapped on his window in the rain and said, without performance or hesitation, you won't manage it alone. And then proceeded quietly, competently, without ceremony, to prove it true. That is the whole arithmetic of it. 4 minutes. 1 column face down on a desk. 1 question never asked on a wet roadside. 1 decision made simply because the situation required it and she was the person there. And that is, in the end, what it means to show up completely for the moment you're actually in. Not the one you planned for, not the one you can see the value of in advance, but the one that is raining and cold and asking nothing of you except that you stop.